Hey, my name is John Flores. I am a Bible teacher at Westside Christian High School. I am also a worship pastor at the church 2 doors down the street at Community of Faith. It's called The Corner. So we as a church have a passion, a heart for our community, and this is one way that we get to express that. And one way that we express that is through conversation, through dialogue with our neighbors. And so we started this thing called BarTalks. That's our target, is to have hospitable conversations. We believe what Jesus did showed us best. He had conversations over meals with people. He ate a lot, he drank with his friends, and he was often accused of just hanging out with tax collectors and sinners. What a great reputation to have. What a rebel. And so we want to do the same thing in our community. We take inspiration from Christ in that regard. And so thank you, really, thank you for coming and joining us this evening tonight. I am so excited for you guys to be able to hear a story of a father and a son who worked at relationship and still do to this present day. I can't recommend their book enough. It's called Space at the Table. And if I can explain a little bit about the book just real quick, it took them a while to figure out who is going to publish this book, because it's one of those dangerous conversations to have from a very strong fundamentalist perspective. And so it took them a while to gain some traction to figure out who is going to actually publish this book and give them the space that they need as a father and son, that I don't think that they just need, but the community needs as well, to process how do we have these conversations when we have, as the book talks about, an evangelical theologian and his gay son. How do we have these conversations and help us, those that don't necessarily have this experience, but how does it help us learn and grow as disciples of Christ to never, ever stop loving our neighbor, no matter who it is? And I'm not just saying that on this side of the table. I'm saying that for Drew and well. He models that so well. Hanging out with this guy, Drew, and I've only met him today, but I've read his book. I feel like I know him obviously more than he knows me. But I feel like he just models this so well. This aspect of relationship and treating someone kindly and graciously. And so there's so much that I get to learn from Drew, and especially from this conversation tonight. Brad and Drew, thank you so much for joining us. If you still want to put orders in for the drinks, just you can quietly get up and go talk to the bartender. I do want to thank and just shout out again 1933 for hosting an event like this. I think that is so awesome. Thank you very much. I keep saying this. I talk to people in West Linn all the time. I feel kind of bad about this. Sometimes I invite people to 1933 more than I do to church. But I just love this restaurant. I think
church doesn't have that brisket.
I know, our church needs that brisket. That is so true. So come continue to support this awesome restaurant. If you liked that sandwich, you'll like all the other ones as well on their menu. It's absolutely wonderful. So Brad and Drew, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Yeah, of course.
I think there's nothing more. There's few things in this world more Christ-like than a good Jewish brisket, actually. So I'm glad that we could enjoy that together tonight.
So I'll just tell you a little bit about myself as we start. So I grew up in California. I grew up in kind of an evangelical Christian church and its culture in California. Decided I wanted to teach the Bible, teach theology. Ended up, I went to Biola and studied theology there, Bible and theology, went to their seminary there. Then I went off to do my PhD work at a Roman Catholic seminary in St. Louis, just to kind of be in somebody else's ballpark for a while. So I was a pastor and a church planter in St. Louis for 13 years. That's where Drew and his sister and brother were born. And then about 23 years ago, I came here to Portland to kind of do the other part of my career, which is coming to a close, as I teach theology and church history at Multnomah University and Multnomah Seminary. So I was listening to Drew tonight talking to someone about the experience of writing this book and talking about how fun it was and all the collaboration and everything, which I totally agree with. But this book was also really difficult for me to write. And it was difficult for me to write because in order to write this book, I had to revisit Drew's childhood, which was difficult. And it was difficult to watch as a father in many ways. Drew was an amazing, wonderful kid. He was funny. He loved all kinds of different things. You know, he could have, by the time he was 5, he could have intellectual conversations with adult neighbors, you know. I mean, in so many ways, he was just a joy to watch. But as as he started, growing, he was 3, 4, 5 years old and had playmates at church and in the neighborhood. One of the things that was a reality for Drew that we saw early on is that he did not conform to the standard cultural ideas about what a boy is supposed to be like, right? So Drew had very little interest in sports. We did have him play t-ball when he was 6, and he really enjoyed it. But that wasn't because he enjoyed the game. It's because he was talking to the moms on the sideline about their latest redecorating projects, and that's what he really enjoyed. Drew wasn't really interested in blowing things up or frying bugs on the sidewalk or those things that boys are supposed to do. He was interested in fashion. He loved opera. And we took him to the opera, and these things were just wondrous moments in his life. But what he found was that it put him out of step with a lot of the life elements of his male peers. And in fact, a lot of them began to make fun of him and to criticize him for what he was like. And as parents watching this was very painful because this is my little boy. And my little boy was beautiful and wonderful and funny and yet just for being himself, he was being criticized in ways that were going deep to the heart of his own self-understanding. I remember there came a moment when Robin and I had talked about this a lot, my wife Robin, and we thought, okay, so what we're seeing in Drew is Drew seems to be interested in a lot of things that, quote, girls are supposed to like. So should we ask somebody about that? So we should get some advice. So we did what all good middle American evangelical families did then. We were living in Missouri. We got in touch with Focus on the Family, right? And so what the guy there told me is, look, when Drew does these things that girls are supposed to do, you tell him no, don't do that. Girls are supposed to do that. And then you take him over and you make him do stuff that boys are going to do. And I went, okay. I went home and I told that to my wife. And we looked at each other and went, no way are we doing that. There's no way we're doing that. Because if we do that, what we're going to tell Drew is that something's really wrong with you. You're really messed up. And there was no way we were going to do that. He was already getting that enough from his peers. And so we decided at that point, no, we're just going to encourage Drew to do the things he loves to do, which we did. But again, as an ongoing experience for him, this created a lot of pain for him in his socialization. So what I'm going to do tonight is, in our kind of talk before we do Q&A, I'm going to deal with 4 kind of little chronological vignettes. So that was number 1, and now I'm going to have Drew respond to that one.
Thanks, Dad. Hey guys, my name is Drew, and I'm really excited to be here with you guys tonight. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you for your hospitality. Thank you for the brisket. And part of the reason that we've set this up in this way is that this is actually the first time that we've done a talk like this in a number of years. And there are a number of reasons for that. But one of those reasons is because I've spent a lot of the last year of my life working through a pretty gnarly crystal meth addiction and getting sober. And so for me to be able to be in a position where I am well enough and sober of mind and well of like spirit and heart enough to come and do this work with my dad is a really exciting thing, but it's also a little bit nerve-wracking for me because it's been a while, and because we'll, hopefully touch on some stuff that is deep, and that's tough to approach sometimes. So again, I really appreciate the warmth and the hospitality of all of you guys here tonight. So when he talks, I'll just kind of respond and like ornament a little bit with my own story. So I noticed, Dad, that you were mentioning focus on the family, and actually, I feel like focus on the family gets a really bad rap, and maybe for good reason. But I also, when I think about my childhood, one of the things that I remember most vividly is, I don't know if any of you guys were parents or grandparents in the 90s, but Adventures in Odyssey? Yeah, come on, what's up, the Adventures in Odyssey? This was a radio show and then eventually a series of tapes, cassette tapes, that was put out by Focus on the Family. And like much of the art and content that was produced during the 90s at the height of the post-Reagan culture wars, this had a really good budget and also like really, really creative, smart people behind it. And so I grew up, as did my brother and sister, loving these stories about these fictional characters who lived in this town of Odyssey, kind of based on old school Colorado Springs, where they would go through life and learn lessons, that God had to teach them. And it was smart and culturally referential, often musical. And I think that that's something that I wanted to bring up and touch on because it exemplifies one of my core experiences of growing up, which is that I loved growing up evangelical. I loved growing up a pastor's kid. I loved growing up going to church on Sundays, on Wednesdays, sometimes on Saturdays, and experiencing what I understood and very much believed to be the transcendent Word of God in the history of human beings as it was able to be accessed by me and applied to my life and the life of people around me, including a world that I sensed from very early on was full of pain and brokenness and hardship. And so the idea for me that I had a personal relationship with God, with a Savior through Jesus Christ and his sacrifice on the cross, was a fundamentally central, animating, and precious experience of my life. I recently went to this big art show in LA where a couple of my friends were showing some of their art. I live in Los Angeles. And it was amazing. It was a specifically like radical, queer, erotic art show, right? There were all kinds of people there, right? And yet, the guy who invited me took me afterwards to go to the backyard of one of his friends in Filipino town. And they do this every week, this group of friends. They get together and they sit around a fire in the backyard and they sing. I don't know if any of you guys are familiar with shape note singing. Yes, okay, excellent. So shape note singing, right, comes out of the tradition of the First Great Awakening, starts in the Northeast, and then eventually goes down to like the Southern Pentecostal Baptist churches. And it was a way of people being able to sing Christian songs, mostly the songs of John Wesley. And it was for people who couldn't read music, right? So it's a so, fa, mi, do, scale, and you have all the notes are either a line, a triangle, a square, a circle, so people can sing 4-part harmonies by following these when they don't know how to actually read music. And this is a really cool, uniquely evangelical American tradition. And yet, all of the people who I was sitting in this circle with, these punks and radicals and musicians and queer people, none of them had grown up in the church. And they've been doing this for a number of years, and they've come to this practice through various ways. Like some of them are really into folk music, they're folk musicians, others of them are just kind of into American spirituality generally. But I had this weird experience where after having a very different kind of experience all day at the art fair, I got to sit around with these same people and tell them what the meaning of all these different Christian hymns were. You know, oh, this one here, you know, is about Jacob and the angel, and when he says, I will not let thou go until thou bless me, this is what that means, you know. Or another one, when we all sang, how firm a foundation, you saints of the Lord, is laid for thy faith in his excellent word. I remembered that I had listened to that song every morning on the radio because it was the theme song for Through the Bible with J. Vernon McGee. You know, and let me say this to you, my beloved. I suddenly felt, and it's interesting how often this happens to me in my adult life, I felt such affection for where I come from and such pride in my traditions that were handed down to me. And that's something that I've only been able to come to after a lot of years of struggle and being very far away from that world. But I wanted to just share that because I think that while it's important to talk about how painful my childhood was in a lot of ways, because yeah, I didn't conform to gender norms. Yeah, I was this flamboyant, over-the-top kid who got bullied pretty intensely growing up in, you know, Missouri. I also think that it's important to talk about how beautiful my evangelical faith, and particularly my evangelical culture, and the way in which I saw love modeled through church and music and community was for me growing up. So why don't you take the next one?
So the next little segment I'll talk about is when Drew came out. Not when he came out publicly, but just when he came out to us, to his mom and me. When he did, had this conversation with us, I did what any good evangelical pastor father does. I panicked, right? And thought, oh my gosh, what am I going to do about this? We've got to fix this, right? Which was clearly a posture of my panic. And so I, encouraged him to get involved in some ex-gay counseling, which he did for a while. And one of the things I'll say about this is Drew was actually very amenable to, where I was going with this. And he was in this environment of saying, okay, Dad, if you're saying that this is not the direction I should go with my life, and God doesn't want me to go this direction with my life, then I want to go along with that. I want to ask God for, strength to live the way he wants me to live. And for several years, we had a lot of conversations around those issues, around the struggles, around him saying, I want to live the way God wants me to live. But as he got older, as he got into middle school, in those mid-teenage years, the tension started to grow between the two of us. And as he felt more and more constrained by his evangelical Christian community, or at least my interpretation of it, his church's interpretation of it, and felt that becoming increasingly oppressive, the tension between the two of us began to grow. And everything changed when he was 17, which is the next vignette I'm going to talk about. But right now, I just want to leave it at this sense of he comes out, we panic, I try to fix this thing, he tries to go along with it. We have a lot of great conversations, but the tension and difficulty really started to grow.
Okay, so I'll take it starting from like the conversion therapy place. So when I was 11, I stayed home from school. I faked an illness so that I could stay home from school for the day, and because I had this call that I knew I had to make. And I had a therapist at the time, and the reason that I already had a therapist at 10 years old is an interesting story in and of itself, but that's probably for another time. But I mean, this therapist was obviously a Christian therapist, but she was also very kind and erudite and interesting in a lot of ways, and I trusted her. And so I knew that I needed to call her and talk to her about something that had been just like increasingly oppressive in my own sense of self. So I got out my 3 referential texts, right? And I laid them out on the coffee table. I had Leviticus chapter 18. I had Bringing Up Boys by Dr. James Dobson, right? And I had The Collected Works of Sigmund Freud. And I had sort of patched together from this triptych of diagnostic texts an explanation that I was ready to offer to this therapist about, okay, here's why this is happening based on my research. And so I called her up at 11 years old and I said, hi, I got her answering machine. You know, she wasn't there. She was a dog trainer, which I always thought was very interesting. She had like these amazing border collies. But so she was probably at a dog event. And I left a message that said, you know, this is Drew. I think we need to talk because I'm experiencing some regressive issues that are manifesting themselves in same-sex attraction. And I need to know how we can nip this in the bud. And so it was a very proactive, like efficient, let's get this thing dealt with right away kind of approach. And so when Dad talks about the fact that I wanted to please him by going to therapy, conversion therapy, that's true, but it's also true that, you know, outside of my kind of direct filial obedience, I also had a sincere desire to please God as I understood God with my life, right? And so for me, the idea that I might be this other thing that was, especially back in the 90s, like it just wasn't something that we talked about back then, or if it was because those people on TV were doing things that were causing harm and problems to the children, and they are bad, and we need to make sure that, you know, our young people are protected from this. And also, like, even though I had probably never even spoken the word AIDS, you don't grow up in the 90s in America without a sense of, if I'm like that, that means this. And so I had a lot of fear that was just like natural fear. And so when my parents sat down with me and were like, yo, we got this, like, there's this place you can go. It's very Cheers, actually. There's a place you can go. But I was stoked, you know. I was happy. I was relieved, I think. And when I look back on it now, I've actually done a lot of thinking about this in the last couple months, the last year of doing a lot of work in therapy. And I note that there was a brief period of time, probably lasting only a week, of my life when I was in 6th grade, when I was first aware of these feelings, that that for that week, for whatever reason, I was preserved from this intense judgment of, you know, within myself coming down on me. And for that week, I was actually going to a place in Vancouver, Washington, where I grew up, that was an arts magnet school. And at that time, there were a bunch of kids there who were gay, who were out. And so for a week, I thought, oh my gosh, this is amazing. This makes sense. I understand that these feelings make me different, but I also see that these people here who I know and like and respect and think are talented and interesting and exciting are that way. So that's cool. I'm great. And then that lasted about a week, and I don't really know what shut that down, but I think it was sort of inevitable that, given the sort of stew in which I was raised and the milieu of being a devout evangelical Christian kid, that eventually that judgment and rejection would come down, you know. inside. And so for the next 5 years, on and off, from age 12 to age 17, I worked really hard in therapy. That was not all the time. Like, there would be months at a time where I wasn't involved, but then there would be months where I would go every week or a couple times a week. And some of it was, individual, and some of it was group therapy. And a lot of my friends who don't grow up in the conservative Christian world, when I tell them that I went to conversion therapy, they gawk and they're like, oh my gosh, like, I've never met someone who did that. Like, your parents must be monsters. That's usually their first response, is like this, your parents must be monsters. And it's been an interesting experience for me to watch a lot of those friends eventually meet my parents and just be like stunned at the incredibly amazing people that they are, who are kind and compassionate and brilliant and erudite and scholarly and funny. And I lament the fact that more of that kind of cross-cultural pollination and relationship doesn't happen now, and I think it's getting actually worse, that we're becoming more and more atomized, and we're not talking to other people who think differently than us. And so it's so easy to look at someone else across from a different perspective and say, like, wow, they must be a monster. And it's interesting, because I think I see that just as much within my queer community, if not more, actually, now, than certainly than I did when I was a kid. And I think there are reasons for that, but I also think that it's a real problem. And so, all that to say, I went through something that a lot of people, especially from a Christian world, don't understand and think is really horrible. And it was horrible in a lot of ways. Looking back, it really messed me up. But my parents didn't intend for it to mess me up. My parents cared about me and believed something very fervently about what, A, God's plan was for me, and B, like, the reasons why this was happening. And so it seems only natural that they would have sought help from people who presented themselves as professionals in this way. And I don't even really, to this day, think badly on the people who did that, who were my therapists, who were my counselors. I think they were living their truth. Do I think it should be legal for kids to undergo what I experienced? No, I don't. I think it's really damaging, and when I look at a lot of the ways that I've acted out in my adult life with drugs and behaviors that have been incredibly self-damaging, most of it can be traced back to those years. So it's an interesting tension to hold, right? In terms of understanding that the world that was telling me that I was bad and broken and needed to be fixed in these ways was something that I think no kid should have to experience. And at the same time, I don't think those people are horrible people. I think we're all trying to live our truth and live out our lives the best we know how. But then that kind of wraps that up, and now we'll move to the next section.
Okay, moment number 3. It was a Sunday afternoon. Drew was 17. It was after church. My wife and I were just in our bedroom, sitting on the bed, just reading the paper or whatever it was. Drew comes into the room and just says, without really any kind of introduction, look, I'm gay. This is who I am. This is how I'm going to live. Get over it. And by the way, I'm also not going to church anymore. I don't believe that stuff. I don't believe the things they're saying. And so I'm done with church. Full stop, right? And walked out. That's a difficult thing for Christian parents, because as Christian parents, and I would be true if you were Muslim parents or Jewish parents or whatever, for us, our faith is at the core of our identities and of how we see the world. It's at the core of how we raise our kids and the dreams that we have for them, and dreams that aren't for ourselves but really for them, because we want them to flourish and to know God and all of this. So to have a kid just say, I'm done with that, it's hard. It's difficult. But it wasn't unexpected. We had seen this process going on in Drew, as we mentioned, the growing tension. We saw that. So we weren't shocked But it created for me a new kind of approach. And that was that once Drew came out publicly, I came out publicly too. And so Drew was out, everyone knows, this is who I am, I'm gay, this is how I'm gonna live my life. I went back to my conservative, evangelical, Christian job as a professor of conservative Christian theology, knowing that I could get a whole lot of interesting reactions about this, and just said, look, as I was introducing myself to my classes, hey, I'm a dad. This is my oldest son, Drew. Drew's gay. I'm not ashamed of my gay son. My gay son is beautiful. I love him. And Robin and I decided, while much of the conservative community wants parents to live in shame about those kinds of things, we just said, no way. We're not going to do it because we simply weren't ashamed of our gay son. I disagreed with Drew, and we still have disagreements about God and sexuality, but it was never going to be an issue of shame with us. And so I just talked regularly at the school about my gay son. This is part of my life. I love him. We love each other. We're committed to being in relationship with one another to the best that we can, even in the midst of the fact that we disagree about something that's very important and deeply rooted in his own sense of self. One of the side effects of that, interestingly enough, again, this is, golly, so half your life ago, so 16 years ago, okay, again, at a conservative Christian, evangelical, Bible college, very quickly, I started to get these knocks on my office door with students walking in and saying, do you mind if we close the door? And students sitting down and saying to me, I've been in the church all my life. I've never told anyone this. My parents have no idea, but I'm gay. I'm lesbian. Or, I know I look like a girl, but I've always known I'm a boy. And these visits started to happen more and more in my office. And what I began to realize, and then later began to talk to Drew about, was there is so much of this stuff hidden under this pressure cooker lid of evangelical expectations and norms, and kids can't even talk to their parents about this stuff. Drew, we have a story that at some point we need to tell so that people can learn that they actually can engage and talk. And it's hard, it's difficult, but that relationships don't have to be shattered. Because the reality is, folks, that of the millions of people who will sleep on the street tonight, over half of the people sleeping on the street tonight are under 18. And most of the people under 18 who are sleeping on the streets tonight in America are there because they're LGBTQ and their conservative religious parents have kicked them out of the home. This is a disaster. This must not be. And I said, Drew, we have to help people move forward. Now, we weren't both ready to write that story then. It took another few years before we were ready. But for me, this is where it began, that we needed to start telling our story.
Yeah, I think it's interesting for me to hear you talk about that now in terms of where that started for you. That makes sense in terms of you coming out on campus as the father of a gay kid and people really starting to show up and flow to your doorstep to be able to find a safe space to share what they were going through. None of that at that time was visible to me. Like, I was not seeing any of that, and I wouldn't come to know that that had been something that my dad had been doing labor around for a number of years. When I was 17, so I'll take it back to like when I was 17 and like what instigated this kind of, somewhat foreseen, but still pretty abrupt shift out of the church. For me, what happened when I was a junior in high school were two important things. The first thing was that I went and lived in a non-Christian country. I went and spent the summer living in Egypt. And then the other thing was that I fell in love. So two things, right? The first is about culture and like the soup that we live in and like the air that we breathe around us all the time. Like if we're just in a place where Christianity is taken as not only the norm, but like the kind of unspoken law of what it means to be an ethical, good person, it makes sense for us to see the world that way. But when I spent a summer living in Egypt, I was there on a program that was done with the US State Department where they took 16 kids from the Middle East and 16 kids from the United States and did an exchange. Those kids came and lived here in homestays, and we went and lived with families in Cairo. And living in a city of 20 million people, most of whom are Muslim, and experiencing, first of all, a place that I had wanted to go to my whole life. Like when I was a kid, I was obsessed with ancient Egypt. I had an ancient Egyptian 8th birthday party, and we had a mummy cake.
We played pin the tail on the Sphinx.
No, pin the nose on the Sphinx. Pin the nose on the Sphinx, you know, and we're saying, again, this is like a long shot for evangelical Christian kid culture of the 90s. I don't know if anyone's going to know this, but like there was a great Bible camp song sung to the tune of Louie Louie that was Pharaoh, Pharaoh, whoa, let my people go. Thank you so much. It's great. The lyrics are transcendent. All of Pharaoh's army did the dead man float. Like, it's great. So yeah, I'd been into Egypt for a long time as a kid, and then I went and lived in Cairo and had the most incredible time. We got to go to the Arab League and hear diplomats talk. We got to do, serve in orphanages and do all these amazing things. I learned Arabic, something that I continued to study and improve for the rest of my life. And in fact, years later, I would go back to Egypt during the revolution while working for a documentary filmmaker and continue to go every year after that for a long time. So this was an animating and amazingly fantasy dream come true experience for me, right? And I looked around at all these other people, these brilliant, sincere, amazing people, and I was like, they're all going to hell? Like, I don't buy it. I don't buy it. And when I started to have relationships with these people, and I started to know who they were as human beings, how they cared about their families, their parents, their kids, their jobs, what the things that they wanted for their country. I remember I had an experience one time with this girl who was very conservative, and she not only did she wear hijab, but she also she wouldn't shake hands with men, but she was so smart. And for the whole summer that I was there, she and I would get together whenever we could, and we would debate theology, right? And she would tell me about her Muslim perspective, and I would come back with my Christian perspective, and we went back and forth, and it was brilliant. It was amazing. And at a certain point, it began to crack for me that these people were all going to spend eternity separated from God. And then, like I said, so that's at kind of like the cultural level. The thing that happened at a personal level is that I fell in love, and the person who I fell in love with loved me back. So I had a best friend who had been my best friend since freshman year, and incidentally, he was also Arab, half American, half Saudi, grew up back and forth between those places, and was hands down the most interesting, brilliant person I'd ever met. I had no idea he was gay, and then one night, as often happens in high school when kids get together, and we had some alcohol that night, and then we kissed, and for me, my world exploded because all of a sudden, this person who had been one of the only people that I'd ever shared my struggles with, which were still very secret, the fact that I would go to conversion therapy and that I was trying to fix this thing, this person was like me. And then for the next several months of the rest of my junior year, we had, this secret that on the one hand brought me a lot of tension and a lot of stress, because you think it's hard hiding your homosexuality from your evangelical father. Try hiding it from your Saudi Arabian father. They don't joke around over there, They're very serious. But it also brought me the greatest joy and the greatest happiness and the greatest personal fulfillment that I had ever known. And what it did also was it gave lie to me to the story, the narrative that had been so fastidiously pounded into my brain that two men cannot love each other and have it be in any way a reflection of God or of the goodness of existence and creation. And so that was the other thing that kind of put a crack in the dam. And so at that point, all of these feelings and these frustrations and these tensions and this sense of how do I change myself and fix myself and be the right person really kind of just exploded through that wall. And so when I came back, I was really, really angry. I was really, really angry. And that anger would continue for a number of years. It would continue for years while my dad was starting to really do a lot of that work that eventually would be some of the work that we would come to do together in writing this book and building bridges. But for me at that point, I was not interested in building bridges. I was interested in getting as far away from the world that I grew up in as possible. And so one other thing that I want to mention real quick before I flip back to Dad, and I appreciate also, by the way, your guys' patience and forbearance in letting me kind of work this out on the spot. Like I said, I haven't done this in a while, so it's a lot of improvisation, and I appreciate that. But I went to New York. I went to school at NYU. I went and studied theater, which is what I'd always wanted to do. And then my second year of school, I took my first ever queer theory class, right? And in this class, it was an introduction to queer theory and critical theory and critical race theory and American history, was taught by this legendary professor. Her name was Lisa Dugan. She was this amazing leather dyke who would just come to school every day in a little miniskirt. And she was brilliant. She was ferocious. She was one of the best teachers I've ever had. And the first book that she assigned us in class was this book called The Family, The Secret Evangelicalism at the Heart of American Power. And this book talked, and I don't know if any of you guys have seen the Netflix series that eventually came out of it, but it was a book that talked about this sort of quote unquote evangelical mafia at the center of, a lot of the power in Washington. And it was this expose, this muckraking expose. And what was interesting to me sitting in the back of the classroom is that as we were reading about these people, these characters in this book, I'm going, I know these people. And not just I know them in the sense of I know people like them. I literally am 1 degree removed from the people that we're reading about. My friend was his intern, and my dad was on the board with this person, And I'm going, there's no way that these people are the monsters that are being portrayed in this book. And as I sat there in a room full of mostly non-Christian, very, left-leaning kids with whom I shared a lot of political values and a lot of cultural values, I started to also speak up for the people that I came from, right? But it was a very painful experience because while I'm speaking up for them, I'm getting on the phone to my dad and cussing him out because, do you know what your friends are doing in Uganda with this kill the gays bill, and all this? And it's the feeling of being split in two was really tough. And so while Dad was already on the road and on his journey to doing this bridge work, I was not ready yet. And it was not after many years of being removed from my Christian community, thinking that I wanted nothing to do with Christianity. And then eventually, by kind of deciding that I wanted to speak up for Christians in a non-Christian environment because the way that they were portraying them didn't feel right to me, that's when I sort of started a journey of asking some different questions.
So the last moment is New York. Drew already started.
Microphone.
Last minute's New York. So Drew already started talking about New York. So when he says he wanted to get as far away from where he grew up as he could, he really meant that. So he went from Vancouver, Washington to New York City, which actually turned out to be great for us because then we got to go visit him a lot, and New York City is just absolutely amazing, right? But it was really, as he mentioned, a whole lot different. And it was during this period that so much of his anger came out towards me. And I mean, part of it was to me just in terms of Brad Harper, his dad. That was part of it. But I don't even think that was the biggest part of it. The biggest part of it was what I represented, right? I represented this religious cultural reality that he had come to see as very oppressive to him. And as we talked and argued during those years, one of the things I said to him was inspired by a line from Chaim Potok's The Chosen, where I just said to him, look, I'll come to you as far as I can. I'll go as far towards you as I can. Just don't ask me to violate my conscience, because then I'm no good to you and I'm no good to myself. And so that's what I did. And so he did ask me to do things, to come towards him, you know, because like one of the things, we'd be together with his gay friends and they'd tell, you know, this gay humor, and I didn't laugh. And he's like, Dad, come on, you gotta laugh at gay humor. This stuff is really funny. And not only that, it's like, how do you think we cope with the pain, right? We're like Jewish people. We have to come up with really good humor because of all the pain that's been going on in our lives, right? Like, okay. So I started laughing at the jokes, and then I remember one time I was in New York with him and his friends, and I actually told a gay joke. And they were like, what? You just told a gay joke? Yeah, I think I'm making some progress, right? So, you know, I did that. And another thing I think that was part of this process of me moving towards him, but also saying, but I can't be different than who I am, is I said, look, I want you to find a partner. I want you to find somebody who loves you like I do, and somebody that you want to spend your life with. And I said, Drew, don't ever ask me to marry you, you know, as a pastor, because I can't. My ordination will not allow me to do that. But you know what? If you want me to be your best man, I will. I'll stand up on stage next to you and be your best man in the midst of this reality, right? And so it was me just learning, I gotta go as far towards him as I can. I don't have to defend God. I don't have to defend Jesus, right? By having all these barriers around me. My job is to love my son in every way that I possibly can, and only stop at those places where I say, this is a place I can't go, and I hope you understand. And Drew was understanding about that, I think, for the most part. And even to this day, I have not come as far, I think, as Drew would like, understandably, but he's been willing to work with that. And he's been willing to stay in relationship with me and to love me and to appreciate where I've come and where I am, even in the midst of the fact that we still have differences. A final thing I'll mention is that Drew has been an incredible help to me in understanding the ethos and the perspectives of the LGBTQ community. I mean, there's the plus on it now, and we just keep going. The thing I love about it, I mentioned this years ago, and Drew just goes, yeah, Dad, that's alphabet soup, you know? And so it's like, don't worry about it. But he has given me so much insight into understanding how these folks feel, how they sense oppression, the pain that they have gone through. Obviously, I saw that in his life, but so many other different kinds of pain out there, how they perceive the world, how they think about politics, how they think about evangelicals. And that's been so helpful for me, because it's become this community of people that I don't have any barriers towards or any animosity towards. We've talked about the fact that some of the most beautiful, wonderful, engaging, delightful people that were always in our house. We always had young people in our house. Were Drew's gay, lesbian, and trans friends. And they were in our home, and they ate with us, and we fed them, and they slept on our floors, and we had conversations about everything openly, and we disagreed, and yet we loved these young people because they were honest and sincere, and they cared about each other, and they saw that we cared about them. And this is the world that Drew introduced me to that I never would have been able to be introduced to at that level without him. And so for that, I'm very grateful.
So I think I'll just quickly say, I'll just kind of cap with saying that, like, I look out into the world today and I see a lot of reason for hope. I see a lot of reason to be like super stoked and excited about the next generation of people on all sides of the political divides. I think there's amazing ingenuity, creativity, patriotism, fervent faith, excitement, and radical commitment within all stripes of American young people. But I also look out and I get really effing depressed because I think that we, through a combination of factors that includes economic factors, social media factors, the way in which algorithms and social media algorithm culture continue to cause us to live only in echo chambers where we just hear other people who think like us. I think that because of that, and also that reality happening at a time where things are really critical right now for everybody. I don't care who you are, gay, straight, black, white, poor, rich, like America and the world at large has a lot of serious problems that we're dealing with. And things are actually most likely going to get worse before they get better, if they get better. That's my particular perspective. But either way, regardless of what you believe about, kingdom come or, what the trajectory of this world is, things right now are really challenging. And instead of having a culture of dialogue where we learn to disagree civilly and to have differences of opinion and to entertain the thought that somebody who thinks differently than us might actually be a good person, instead what we have is a culture that says those people hate you. Those people hate us. Those people hate America. Those people hate human beings. And it's on both sides. It's on both sides. All the sides. And one of the things, I had an interesting conversation 2 days ago with a buddy of mine. His name is Andrew, and Andrew went to the same super conservative Christian middle school that I went to. Andrew's family was a lot more conservative than mine was, in fact. Andrew, now he's a journalist. He's a writer in Portland. He writes for liberal mags. He does the, coverage, the gay coverage of a lot of the news events and gay culture there. And Andrew and I were talking about how frustrated we are with a lot of young queer kids that we feel just don't have any respect or space for people who have a different position than them. And we all of a sudden had this moment where we were like, oh my gosh, you know what they sound like? They sound like the environment that we were raised in 90s and early 2000s evangelical America at middle school, where we were taught that anybody who believed something different than us was going to hell and was like a bad person and couldn't love their family, couldn't love God, and that disturbs us. It makes me sad, and it makes me frustrated, and it makes me discouraged. But it also makes me understand that, we have work to do. And I think that if you believe in Christ, I think that if you believe in the words of Jesus about what it is to sit in the pain and the brokenness of the world, and what it is to love the world and to engage with people who the world sees as wrong or outside in various different ways, I think that anybody, whether they're a Marxist, liberation theology, leftist, post-episcopal, or if they are a conservative, Bible Belt, Tea Party Republican, I don't really care. I think that if you believe in the words of Jesus, we understand that our calling is to serve people who are in need, to bring food to the hungry, to bring love to the unloved. And I think that we're not doing a great job of that right now. And I know that my people, when I speak of like the LGBT community right now, I don't think we're doing a great job of it right now. And so like, it's interesting because years ago when we would do these talks, my dad would often begin with an apology, and he would apologize, especially if we were in like a heavily gay, environment. And he also says this in the book where he's like, I want to apologize for the ways in which you've been treated, the way you've been parodied, lampooned, bullied. And I think that that's appropriate that my dad did that. But I also want to, in this, what I assume is a probably pretty majority Christian, maybe majority conservative community, I want to apologize on behalf of a lot of the people who are right now doing work as mouthpieces for my community, and the ways in which they have lampooned, pilloried, degraded Christian people and people who believe differently than them, because that ain't right. It's not right. And I am so sorry for the fact that there seem to be so many people on my side of the divide right now who don't see the humanity. And you know what I think? I think it's their loss. I think it's their loss. And I think that if we don't learn how to see the humanity in people who believe really differently than us, I think it's our loss.
Whew. You guys, thank you very much for sharing your story. Really appreciate that. And if at all you're moved to laughter, joy, maybe thinking through some of your own stories and your own experience, or even perhaps moved to tears, I think their book would do that all the more. Space at the Table. I highly recommend getting a copy and reading through that. We're going to open up the space here for a time of question and answer, or I like to say question and response. If you are not one who is comfortable holding a mic and asking a question with a projection and speakers, please feel free to write a question on the piece of paper that's on your table. I'd be happy to come pick it up. Laura would be happy to come pick it up as well. Just hold it up and we'll grab that. If you feel comfortable asking a question, just raise your hand and I'll bring you the mic. And they would love to take some questions from the audience at this time.
Would you please say your names also as you...
Can you hear me? I'm Jill Vigiano. I'm an elder at Community of Faith, so, and I've had a chance to chat. This has been great. I'm curious to know how your mom, how your wife, how Robin has handled all of this.
Better.
Yeah, Robin has been just a really important presence in all of this. Not in the sense that she's necessarily in between us in terms of what she believes or whatever. It's just really personally how she has helped Drew and me. Her personality is really different than ours. Drew and I, just the way it was when he grew up. Drew and I, we say what we think. We're both really good arguers. And so when Drew and I would disagree, we would just get everything out on the table and argue and yell at each other and sometimes say hurtful things to each other. And when it was all said and done, we would apologize to each other, hug each other, and go on, right? That's not Robin's personality. And she saw sometimes how some damage had been done, and it looked like we'd walked away, but it was like, no, Brad, you said something there that was really hurtful, that could be hurtful long term. You need to be really careful about that. I think she did similar things for Drew, so she would come to us and kind of be an advisor for both of us about how to do things better in a way that was perhaps, less damaging. So anyway, that's one of the ways I saw Mom being involved.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think as many of you are probably intoning from that answer, that's a lot of the more divine feminine work, right? That's a lot of the work that I think is part of the more, if we want to call it that, the divine feminine character. I think that it's interesting because I think that I have parts of me that were very much like that with my dad, that were able to do that more confrontational, aggressive, more typically masculine, battle it out on the stage of ideas, kind of confrontation. But oftentimes I think I had a lot of emotional stuff that wasn't resolved, or that would just that only years later, because my mom and I were not close really until, interestingly, probably until my senior year of high school. I think we fought a lot and were very much at odds, and I didn't really understand her. And I think a lot of that was because I didn't understand how much I was like her internally. I think externally, I'm very much like my dad. I look like him. I have a lot of his affects, and how he talks, how he communicates. He's a Capricorn, but that's fine. Whereas my mom, who is a Libra, yeah, exactly. Right, exactly. Yeah. My mom, her and I actually have a lot more similar emotional topography inside. And so things that would get resolved at the level of the cerebral, right, which again is the more male Apollonian kind of world of the rational, supposedly this is how we think about it in the West a lot anyways. Whereas the things that were more internal and, just deeply emotional. It was a long time. I think it was not until I came out that I was even able to start being open to that world, right? Because for so long that was repressed. And so once I had the freedom of saying, no, I'm gay, this is who I am, and I like it. I like who I am. I don't reject it anymore. I think actually my mom and I were able to bond in a different way that we had not, and we were able to connect in a different way. And that helped a lot in the ensuing years when I was really mad at my dad, and my mom would do a lot of bridge building work, right? And it's always hard because as a parent, you don't want to be stuck between your child and your spouse, right? That's not fair and it's not healthy. And, we can do the whole Freudian family romance thing, that's just a problem. But at some points also, as any member of a family, brother, sister, mother, father, son, daughter, sibling, child, you are in a place where you are able to do emotional labor between two people who are not working it out for whatever reason. And that's something that I think often moms are able to do. Not all. Sometimes it's the dad who does that more. But she definitely performed that work.
Hello. You guys have a wonderful story, and a wonderful story about reconciliation. To me, it seems like, addressing Dad here, that he has learned empathy as much as anything else. He comes from an evangelical background, which I think can be characterized sometimes as somewhat legalistic and judgmental. And how has your reconciliation and empathy affected your role within the evangelical community, especially as a teacher?
That's a really, really insightful thing. I've been a member of the evangelical community all my life. maybe less so culturally anymore. But you know, as the years I spent as a pastor and the earlier years as a professor, spending a lot of time in conservative evangelical churches, I think I could just generally say for evangelicals largely, not evangelical individuals, but as a culture, there was no empathy for gay people. None. In fact, it was so limited that the way evangelicals viewed gay people was that they simply were sinners who made perverted choices. They chose to be that way, right? They had absolutely no awareness about how sexual understanding and sexual and gender understanding develops within LGBTQ people, and so they just saw it as a perverted choice. And when you see something someone does is simply a perverted choice, you can't have empathy for them. You cannot. You know, I came to understand through my son's experience, he didn't choose this. You know, I speak on this a lot, and I tell audiences, look, middle school boys don't sit on the curb waiting for the bus in the morning thinking, okay, today I'm going to decide, gay, straight, gay, straight, gay, straight. They don't do that. They just come to realize what their identity and feelings are just like anybody else does, just like straight people do. And it's not an issue of blame or guilt. And when I started to realize that, you know, with Drew, I began to understand, look, this isn't about people just making sinful choices. It's about people coming to realize and cope with things that are part of who they are they didn't have any choice about at all. And when you understand that someone is going through a painful situation about which they didn't really have any choice, how can you blame them for that, right? And instead there needs to be this sense of understanding of saying, oh my goodness, I need to learn more about this person. I need to hear their story. I need to hear how they came to this place where they are. Because when I hear their stories, all of a sudden, the blaming, the anger, the finger pointing, it just goes away, right? And so for me, one of the things I've had the opportunity to do is try to help evangelicals understand that so that they can begin to think with empathy. They can begin to think with a sensitivity and about a desire to understand, because empathy is about understanding, right? About a desire to understand people who are very different than they are and to understand it in a way that's radically different than what they've been taught by their conservative community.
I appreciate your question a lot. I think it's really, yeah, as my dad said, insightful, and it was very moving, actually. I think that empathy is really hard. I think empathy is particularly hard when we feel that there's a lot at stake, right? And when we, especially when we think about when we see ourselves as in positions of defending the vulnerable, right? So to feel empathy towards someone who we think is creating a world where that's going to be harmful to people we love, then it becomes really, really difficult work. Really, really difficult. And I want to acknowledge that that's just like, I don't have a solution for that. You know, I don't have a fix. I get really, you know, so I'm pretty cisgender, right? I'm cis-ish, you know, like I like being male. I feel comfortable in my body. I've never really identified as trans in any way. You know, the fact that I like to wear like dresses and robes and other beautiful flowy garments is just because I have great taste. It's not, you know, because, and I think Bad Bunny will agree with me on that, right? And like, it's interesting that we're seeing that in the culture now. But like, so when I can't speak to the trans experience from a personal point of view, right? So when I hear, because a lot of, and the reason I'm bringing this up is because so much of what seems to be the most vitriolic, hateful wars right now that are going on have to do around like with trans issues and like trans kids, like young people who are identifying as trans, and then their parents and their teachers and the people at the level of the school systems who are saying, what should we talk about? What should we not talk about? And the thing is, like, all of that is really messy. It's really, really messy. And what I wish we had is not only empathy, but I wish we had a lot more patience in this country. I wish we had a lot more patience in this culture to, like, hear out somebody else's perspective, even if we end up thinking that it's really wrong, and just like sitting with it for a while. I wish that my trans friends and my friends who are activists for certain legal aspects of the LGBT agenda or experience, as it is often codified, which is a misnomer and it doesn't really reflect the reality, but like whatever, this is the cultural discourse. I wish that a lot of people on my side of things would be more patient, and I wish that a lot of people on the other side of things would be more patient, because this is people's lives and it's people's beloved like children that parents on both sides are trying to like, they feel like they're defending their kids, right? And I hate the fact that we don't have, it's really frustrating to me, I want to use the word hate as little as possible. It's really frustrating to me that we don't have a conversation where we can say, yeah, I think the way you're parenting your kid, or that you want to change things in my school where my kid goes, is really wrong and damaging, but I'll see you on Sunday. You know, I'll see you at the potluck, I'll see you at church, I'll see you at the football game, I'll see you whatever it is. And again, I think a lot of that is due to the fact that we now live in really closed circuits. We live in closed circuits where we don't go out and meet with other people. We aren't, and COVID has made this worse, right? COVID has made this so much worse because we only get the echo chambers of online. We don't actually see other people who we have different lives with, but actually share the life of being citizens and people in this country, Americans, together. You know, I had this experience on a bus this summer. I got attacked a couple times this summer, like physically and verbally attacked on the bus in LA with like homophobic slurs and stuff. And it was interesting because like a number of these experiences were from black guys, right? And for me, as somebody who has been really trained in like critical race theory of like, okay, the first thing I think about is like why, you know, this person has grown up in poverty and they've grown up in a situation where white supremacy also includes, you know, homophobia and heteronormativity. And so this way of thinking has been put into them by a system that tells them that there's a finite amount of the pie, and if these people are trying to take some of the pie, it means it's going to take some away from you. All that goes through my head in like a rapid fire instant moment, and yet I'm still having this experience of like this dude is attacking me or coming at me and saying these things. And it happened a number of times this summer, and one of the times, I mean, they all sort of ended differently, but one of the times this guy on the bus was just screaming and yelling at me and talking about how these faggots want to get our kids and they're all pedophiles and they want to like come after our children. And like, I decided to do something that I don't normally do, which I was just like, all right, let's talk about this. Let's talk about this. We're going to talk about it. We're on the bus. You and I are both on the bus. We're going to talk about this. And it was literally a situation where anytime he would make a point or I would make a point, he would come running at me and I would have to like retreat to the other side of the bus, right? And this went on for like several stops. And the other people on the bus were sitting there just like, oh, they could not believe it. The driver was freaking out, but you could have heard a pin drop, right? Because the two of us were just going back and forth. And it was so interesting. It ended, the conversation took a change because he kept saying, he was like, I don't need to listen to what you say. You're not a man. You're not a man. And then at one point I was like, okay. He was like, you don't understand my experience, and I don't want to know about your experience because you're not a man. And you don't understand my life. And I was like, but aren't we both Americans? Are we not both Americans? Do we not live in this country together and share this experience? And it was crazy because that one thing completely diffused the situation. And I look back at that now and I think, okay, yes, empathy was involved. But it was also like patience in the fact that both of us, him who, again, his life probably sucks. He's a homeless black dude in Los Angeles. He probably not probably, he's gone through things and will continue to go through things that I will never have any idea about. I'll never get it. And my experience is my experience. But the two of us, even though we nearly came to blows, were patient enough to continue talking about something, even at this elevated level, and then eventually we found some common ground. And I wish that that happened more.
Yes, my name is Diane. I'm wondering if you found a community of faith where you feel completely accepted, a place to worship. And
I have, but it doesn't look like what you'd think. Part of that community is, I would describe my community of faith where I feel comfortable worshiping as a quilt. It's a variety of different experiences. Part of it is when I go home and I get to go to my parents' church, right? And I love their church. I know the people there. I grew up with them. A couple years ago, I started taking the Eucharist again, and it was one of the most powerful changes that I've ever made in my life, was allowing myself to come back to the Lord's table and to experience that. So I love when I get to go home and go to my parents' church. But another part of my community of faith looks like when I drive 3.5 hours down to Wolf Creek, Oregon, north of Grants Pass, and hang out at the Radical Ferry commune, where, and I'm sure that I doubt that any of you guys know what the Radical Ferries are, but I mean, we're talking like a subculture of the gay community that basically is a bunch of like nerds and DIY, kind of like spiritually expressive, almost like doomsday prepper-esque, like guys in a sparkly dress who could also like re-weld your entire plumbing system, like, and like I like hanging out with these, like, I mean, these gays carry guns, let me tell you, okay? They can, and so like when I'm down there and we have like, our spiritual gatherings, which follow the calendar of the English pagan wheel of the year, right? Which interestingly is very much aligned with the Christian calendar, because a lot of the early church, especially in Europe, took things like, for example, what's happening right now, which is Samhain, which is the Celtic festival of the new moon in Scorpio, and it became All Hallows Eve, right? From which we get Halloween. So I'll go down there and go to a Samhain gathering where we'll all sit around a fire and talk about our ancestors and our dearly beloved dead, and ask for guidance and, pray to whoever we pray to. And that's equally valuable to me. And I couldn't imagine my spiritual well-being without either of those things. Eucharist in the evangelical church at home and like Samhain bonfire. And I think that that's going to be more and more common. I hope it becomes more and more common as we move into the 21st century and people feel more able to be creative with how they meet their spiritual needs. That's my opinion, that's my perspective, but yeah.
It's been my experience with the gay community that...
And would you guys say your name again, by the way?
I'm Don.
Don, hey Don.
It's been my experience with the gay community that they are very expressive, erotic, sexual, and everything that line of environment comes out in every situation. And to me, and I believe that that's why it's coming out in the schools so much with the educational thing. They want to show that erotic side of transgenderism. And it's hard for me to understand, because if somebody would do the things that are happening in those transgender education periods to kids, they would have been arrested in my day. They've been arrested because they were doing sexual things in front of kids that are just children. But somehow, to try to make it more normalized, or what's happening and how that community works, they want to show all that stuff. And I would be interested to hear how you feel about whether or not that's a good thing or a bad thing.
Sure, that's a great question. It's a big question, and it's a question that, I'll be honest, because I haven't done a deep research dive into the actual curricula that's being put forward, I feel a little bit unprepared to answer that question to my own satisfaction. But I'll say that I think a lot of people on both sides of the divide haven't done a deep curricula dive either, and yet these people seem to feel very confident in talking about what's happening. And that I feel worried about, because I think that on the one hand, we have the results of, let's call it, this sexual and gender revolution of the last couple decades, wherein some of these experiences or identities that for a long time in the West and in America and in Western European culture over the last couple hundred years certainly existed, but were not, especially since Victorian times, were not talked about in polite society. And those experiences and then identities that have been created or formed around those experiences have now come out of what we would call, what me in my experience would call like an oppressive closet. And I think that a lot of that, I mean, when the sexual revolution was happening, the way I understand it, it's about adults and adults living the lives that they want to live. But what's interesting about the gay rights movement is that after the 1970s and 80s, and really particularly after the basically after AIDS, because AIDS wiped out so many people, and it was so catastrophic for the community. And after that, there was a real shift in the quote-unquote gay agenda, where a lot of the people who were at the forefront of the community in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, 80s had been, again, leftists, Marxists, had been interested in poverty and how to alleviate general poverty, how to create income equality, gays were not about marriage in the 1970s. Most gay people, if you look at the literature, they wanted to abolish marriage entirely. They were like, marriage is a patriarchal system of ownership and property and all of this. And the way in which things shifted after the AIDS epidemic is that the gay people who survived looked around and were like, okay, if we want a seat of power, if we want a place at the table of power, and we know that we need that because we watched a government and an entire country just completely ignore what happened to us and not open up funding and say, you faggots deserved this, and whole families watch their children die and be like, that's what you deserved. If we want a seat at the table of power, we have to play it by their rules. We have to beat them at their own game, which is why after the mid-90s, you see the gay agenda shift onto literally the three most conservative tenets of American culture: adoption, military service, and marriage. No gay people wanted, or very few gay people wanted to serve in the military, adopt families, adopt children, and have traditional heterosexual marriage as our political goals in the 1960s and 70s. It just wasn't what the community wanted. But the result of that is that you now have what I would call queer respectability or gay respectability, which is this phenomenon that gay people are now it feels like we are now able to take part fully in the American dream of being good citizen subjects under capitalism, and we make a lot of money, and we can own homes and have families and contribute in these respectable ways. We can go to church, and I think all of that is really great. I think it's really good. But another thing that's happened is that you have gay people now visible, right? You have gay couples. You have kids going to school with other kids whose parents are gay. And the idea that we wouldn't be able to say that there are some kinds of marriages and other kinds of marriages, and for parents to be able to tell their kids, you know what, we don't believe that that's not in line with what we believe in our faith, in our family, in our home. Like that, to me, I don't see how that's an American value in terms of not being able to talk about these differences. Now, when you talk about sexual things being done in front of kids, I want to understand what you mean by that, because tell me what it is that you're most afraid of, because I want to understand it.
In a recent video that I saw, there was transgender folks there, and they were doing like lap dance type activities, gyrations, and this one guy that was dressed up as a gal had his penis and ball sack in a special compartment. So he would lift up his dress and flip his junk around in front of these kids. And these kids are fifth graders. And you know, I'm thinking, you know, if somebody had done that when I was growing up to kids, they would have been arrested. You can't show your junk to kids. It's just not, it's not cool.
Yeah.
But there's a whole auditorium full of kids, and these people are doing that kind of stuff. That's the kind of eroticism and stuff that I'm concerned about.
Sure. So like that sounds terrible. And I really think that that's in terribly bad taste. And like I think it's really unfortunate and gross and immature of that adult to act that way. If you know, if that the way you describe that is really.
And what made it worse is that the kids were given dollar bills to give to the dancers.
Oh, like a stripper, like a dancer.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, like that kind of like one of the things for me that is interesting, and like I'm not a parent. I'd like to one day raise a kid and have a kid. I think I would very much like to be a parent, but I'm not a parent right now, so I can't understand it, right? But if I were looking out at the world today as a parent, I would see a couple of things going on. I'd see like, I think there's a hypersexualization of the culture, just generally, and I don't think that I think that was happening before gay people or like trans people started talking about having these kinds of things in curriculum. Like, I think that's been happening for a long time. And like, I think that there are real problems with the hypersexualization of culture, mostly not because I'm anti-sex. I'm actually very pro-sex. I have pretty radical sexual ethics. But I believe that sex as commodity, sex as a cheap commodity that is just like paraded in that way as a part of capitalist consumer culture is really messed up because it dehumanizes people. Now, I believe that there's a time and a place for that kind of performance, but it's not with kids at a school. Like, and here's the thing. I think if you knew a lot more gay people and trans people, you would know, and this is not a fault of yours. I'm just saying that, like, if you happened to have a bunch of friends who were in that community, I think you'd find that my opinion that I'm expressing right now is far more the majority of opinion. I don't know any gay people or trans people who would be trying to put that in schools. And so when I hear about that, I get concerned, I get angry, I feel scared, because I know that shit, if that's what they're saying trans people want to do, and if these people are doing this in a school and these videos are happening, well, what does that mean for all of the people that I know who all they want is to be able to just be who they are as human beings? And like, if they're a trans person or trans parents and they have a kid at school and like there's, you know, some kid asks about this, that they say, yeah, there are gay people, there are trans people, some of them are married, some of them, you know, most people are born with these. I mean, we learn this as kids, that people are born with these body parts or these body parts. You know, most people are born with one set of either. Some people, and it is actually like larger percentage than most, certainly than I do, in terms of like people who are intersex in various ways and born with, you know, multiple different kinds of hormonal things going on. Like, that's a percentage. It's all part of the human experience. But talking about sex or sex acts is something that I think should be reserved until kids are approaching that age and puberty is happening, and then they have questions. and that's the way it's been done traditionally in American schooling, right? But I also think that that anything like that, a sexual act like that being done in front of children is inappropriate regardless of what your gender expression is. That's just like really gross and in bad taste, you know? So I don't know. That was a long answer, but I really appreciate you giving me like your specifics, and I'm really sorry that that happened, and I hate it that that's what's going around, but I'm also glad that you asked me about it because, you know, at least we're having a dignified conversation about it.
Hey, Don, I'm going to give you a really short answer to that question, but one that's just really different and really from my side. You know, I remember the first time Robin and I were at a Pride Parade. It was in New York City. And the New York City Pride Parade is like a big deal, right? And my, you know, I mean, I don't, it's pride there. I mean, my son's gay. It's not like I'm angry or upset, but it's like, why does it just have to be so out there, you know, and stuff like this? And here's the deal. Whether it's in sexuality or race or various other things, when people are oppressed for a long, long time and they get a space to move out, they don't generally go to the middle. They generally go as far as they can go. And the thing is, while I might not like where they go, I need to understand why they went there. Because they've been oppressed for 200 years, and they finally got some space. So I just need to understand it.
Really good question. Thanks, Don.
Well, I have the same feelings that you do. You mentioned with the feelings shock and awe and all that other stuff. I have the same feelings and I'm afraid.
Yeah.
I'm afraid of what's going to happen to that culture. It's sexualized at such an early age by what I would consider bizarre sexual expressions. Whether it be heterosexuals or homosexuals doing it, that kind of activity is just bizarre.
Yeah, and I think that parents should have full autonomy to say if in their homes and have their children express these views in school. Like one of the things that I really hate about politically correct culture is that it says that certain views are just by nature of what they are wrong. And I don't think that that's fair. I think that kids should be able to express what they believe, and if they have conservative Christian parents who are teaching them about a certain perspective of the world, I don't think those kids should be shushed. I don't think they should be told that your view is wrong. I don't think that they should be told that their view is hate speech. I think that we need a whole different vocabulary to talk about this. But like, this stuff takes time, and it takes like failing a lot. I think as a culture we have to be more comfortable with like not getting it right, and like, but again, people feel invested. They feel like, we all feel like a lot is at stake, because we look at the economy, or we look at the climate, or we look at the society, or we look at international relations, you know, weapons buildup, whatever it is, Russia, China, the dollar, you know, and we're all going like, crap, what is the future gonna look like for my kids, or for, you know, just the next human generation? For me, you know, in 5 years. And so I think that understanding that we're all in kind of like a heightened trauma response state all the time, and having better societal mechanisms for like, we're gonna try, we're gonna get it wrong, people are gonna be upset all over, and we have to like be willing to say sometimes that didn't work, you know?
Okay, thank you very much for engaging in the question and answer time. As these things often take an organic conversation and back and forth, I lost track of time and I feel so bad. It is 7:55, and so I want to try to be a good guest. We're going to try to clear some of these tables. On your way out, if you'd like to thank them, please do, but would you please give them a round of applause? If you would also like to put it in your calendars, we're going to be doing another BarTalks Tuesday, November 29th. And this title might sound like an oxymoron, but it's possible: How to Engage in Politics Without Getting Angry. And we're going to have Professor Paul Metzger come on in and walk us through that tragedy of a conversation. So we'll see what happens there. But thank you very much for coming out this evening. Be safe. God bless you.